Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. And today we're going to be talking about a pretty heavy topic.
Yeah,
Christian persecution in Nigeria.
it's a tough one.
We've got a whole bunch of recent news reports,
Uh-huh.
mostly from outlets that focus on Christian issues.
Okay.
And honestly, they paint a really grim picture.
Yeah.
But we're not going to just recount the headlines. We really want to dig deeper,
Yeah.
try to understand the complexities,
All right.
and really see what we can learn from all of this.
I think that's really important.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the emotion of these stories.
Right.
And rightfully so, they're horrific.
They are.
But I think it's important to try to take a step back and look for the patterns.
Yeah.
The underlying currents that are driving this whole situation.
Okay, so let's jump right in.
Yeah, let's do it.
One of the most recent attacks that we have in our materials here happened on December 22nd during a Christmas carol service. 14 people were killed, including a 1-year-old baby and a pregnant woman.
That's awful.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a more vulnerable group being targeted during what should be a time of celebration.
And it's not like this was an isolated incident either.
Oh, really?
On Christmas Day, there were attacks in Kwandi County,
My gosh.
where the death toll it climbed from an initial report of 11 to a confirmed 33.
Wow.
One resident, Didi Jira, was quoted saying the community was just in shock,
Yeah.
just waiting for the government to do something.
It's heartbreaking to think about the scale of the violence, and what strikes me is that these aren't just numbers.
Right.
These are real people with families and communities who are left reeling after this.
Absolutely.
We've got reports about a pastor, Samson Ogbabor, who woke up at 3 a.m. to the news that his church had been burned down.
Oh, my goodness.
Then there's a story of the Reverend Manasseh Ibrahim, who was killed while traveling to minister to his congregation.
Oh, God.
And then we also have Olawakemi Moses, a pastor's wife, who was murdered along with her 2-month-old baby.
That's just awful.
It's really hard to hear these stories.
And I think what's so striking here is that these individual tragedies, as awful as they are,
Right.
they seem to be echoing this larger story playing out in Nigeria.
Yeah.
We're looking at reports suggesting over 16,000 Christians have been killed in Nigeria between 2019 and 2023.
So this isn't just a few isolated incidents. This is pointing to a much bigger problem.
Yeah, a much bigger problem.
But the question that immediately comes to mind for me is, who's behind all of this?
Well, a lot of these attacks are attributed to the Fulani herdsmen.
Okay.
But it's really important not to oversimplify this.
I'm glad you bring that up. I have to admit, I don't know a ton about the Fulani.
Okay.
Can you give us a little background?
Sure. So the Fulanis are a largely Muslim nomadic group,
Okay.
and they've often been in conflict with farming communities over land and resources.
I see.
So these tensions, they have really kids' roots.
Yeah.
Historical, economic.
Right.
And unfortunately, they get tangled up with religious differences sometimes.
And that's when things can turn violent.
And that's when things can turn violent. Exactly.
So it's not as simple as saying all Fulani are extremists who are targeting Christians.
No, not at all.
Okay.
It's important to remember that not all Fulani are involved in these attacks.
Right.
And to understand that violence often comes from this complex mix of social, economic, and religious factors.
I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
It's so easy to fall into the trap of black and white thinking.
Absolutely.
Especially when we're dealing with something as emotionally charged as religious violence.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so crucial to dig deeper and try to understand the nuances of this situation.
Okay, so we've got this complex backdrop
Right.
of historical tensions and resource conflicts, but there's clearly a religious element at play here as well.
Right.
I mean, why else would Christians be targeted?
Well, that's where things get really interesting and perhaps even more difficult to untangle.
Okay.
So, while religious tensions are definitely a factor, they're often interwoven with issues of land ownership competition for resources and long-standing grievances that go back generations.
I see.
It's rarely a case of one single cause.
Right.
It's more like a tangled knot of different factors feeding into each other.
So while the Fulanis are often named as the perpetrators in these attacks, we need to be careful about making sweeping generalizations.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the complexities of the conflict without minimizing the very real suffering of the Christian community in Nigeria.
Okay, so speaking of cases that highlight this suffering, I think it's worth revisiting the story of Deborah Emmanuel Yakubu, the Christian college student who was stoned to death back in May 2022.
Right.
This case really captured global attention, didn't it?
Yeah, this case was particularly horrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, aside from the sheer brutality of the act, what made it stand out was that it was filmed.
Oh, wow.
And shared on social media.
That's awful.
And that really amplified the horror.
Yeah.
And brought it to a global audience in a way that we hadn't seen before.
It's almost like social media added another layer of violence to the situation, you know?
It's a disturbing trend.
Yeah.
And one that raises some serious questions about the role of social media.
Right.
In inciting and amplifying violence.
Yeah.
Not just in Nigeria, but globally.
It's like social media has become this double-edged sword.
It really has.
On one hand, it can be a powerful tool for raising awareness and mobilizing people for good.
Right.
But on the other hand, it can be used to spread hate, incite violence, and dehumanize entire groups of people.
Precisely. And Deborah Yakubu's case is a stark reminder of that dark side of social media.
And what's even more tragic is that despite the international outrage that followed her death, the violence continues. It's a reminder that awareness alone isn't enough.
No, it's not.
We need to find ways to translate that awareness into meaningful action.
Absolutely, and that's where things get even more challenging.
Right.
We've seen condemnations, we've seen calls for action, but lasting change remains elusive.
So it feels like we're stuck in this cycle of violence and outrage.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
You know, we see a horrific attack.
Right.
There's a global outcry.
Yeah.
And then nothing really changes.
And that begs the question, what can we do to break this cycle?
Right.
What can we learn from Deborah Yakubu's case and the countless other tragedies that are unfolding in Nigeria?
That's the question we all need to be grappling with.
Yeah, because it's clear that awareness alone isn't enough.
No, it's not.
We need to find ways to address the root causes of this violence.
Absolutely.
And create a more just and peaceful society for all Nigerians.
And that's where our deep dive really needs to go next. We need to move beyond simply describing the problem and start exploring potential solutions.
Yeah.
Because even in the face of such immense suffering, I believe there's always room for hope.
I agree. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from Deborah Yakubu's story.
Yeah.
That even in the face of such darkness, we can't give up hope.
We cannot.
We have to keep searching for solutions, keep fighting for justice, and keep believing in a better future for Nigeria.
Well said.
So let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture.
Sounds good.
Our sources mentioned a report from ADF International that highlights 2 Nigerian universities, one federal and one state, that have barred Christian students from using any facilities for worship or fellowship.
Now, this is a perfect example of the less visible, but equally insidious forms of persecution that Christians are facing in Nigeria.
So it's not just about bombs and bullets.
No.
It's also about the systematic erosion of religious freedom.
You got it.
So it's like a slow suffocation of their rights.
Yeah.
Making it harder and harder for Christians to openly live out their faith.
And what's really concerning is that this kind of discrimination often flies under the radar. Doesn't make the same headlines as a violent attack.
Right.
But the long-term impact can be just as devastating.
It's like a slow poison.
Yeah.
Gradually eroding their freedoms and creating a climate of fear and oppression.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to bring these issues to light. And to understand the different ways in which religious persecution manifests itself.
So we're seeing violence.
Yes.
We're seeing discrimination. And we're seeing a real lack of justice and accountability for those responsible.
It paints a pretty bleak picture.
It does.
And, you know, when we look at the broader context of Christian persecution globally, the situation becomes even more concerning.
Really?
The Open Doors World Watch List 2024 ranks Nigeria as the 6th worst country in the world for Christian persecution.
6th worst in the entire world.
Wow, that's really alarming.
It is. And the statistics are even more staggering.
Okay.
Over 82% of Christians killed globally for their faith in 2024 were in Nigeria.
That's a mind-blowing statistic.
It is.
We're talking about the vast majority of Christians killed for their faith being concentrated in just one country.
Exactly. And it's not a new phenomenon.
Oh, wow.
Jeff King, the president of International Christian Concern, estimates that up to 100,000 Christians have been murdered in Nigeria over the past 20 years.
Oh my gosh.
With 3.5 million displaced from their lands.
Those numbers are just unfathomable.
They are.
It's hard to even grasp the scale of the suffering that's happening there.
It is, and it's a stark reminder of the urgent need for action.
Right.
We can't afford to let this continue.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about the recent attacks,
right?
The Deborah Yakubu case, the role of social media, the complexities of the conflict.
Right. The different forms of persecution and the global context.
A lot to process.
It's a lot to process, and I'm sure our listener is feeling a little overwhelmed right now.
I wouldn't blame them. It's a heavy topic.
Yeah.
And one that can easily lead to despair.
Right.
But I think it's important to remember
that
even in the face of such darkness, there are still stories of resilience, hope, and faith.
You're absolutely right. We can't let the darkness consume us.
We cannot.
We have to hold on to those glimmers of hope and keep searching for solutions.
Exactly. And I think that's a good point to transition to the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
You know, we've laid out the harsh realities.
Right.
But now we need to start exploring what can be done to address this crisis.
Yeah.
Because I believe that even in the most challenging situations, there's always a reason to hope.
I couldn't agree more so. Stay with us as we delve into potential solutions.
Yes.
And explore how we can all contribute to a more just and peaceful future for Nigeria.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this.
Yeah, that's a lot.
But I think it's important to remember we're not just talking about numbers and statistics here.
Right.
We're talking about real people.
Yeah.
Families, communities who are living through this nightmare every single day.
You're absolutely right. And before we get to the, what can we do part, I think it's important to understand the why is this happening part.
Right.
Like, what are the root causes that are fueling this violence and discrimination?
Well, you've got this really complex interplay of religious and ethnic identities in Nigeria.
Okay.
The country is almost evenly split
between
a Muslim majority north and a Christian majority south.
Okay.
But within those broad categories, there are so many different ethnic groups.
I see.
Each with their own history, loyalties, and rivalries.
It's like a giant puzzle where all the pieces are constantly shifting.
It really is.
So it's not as simple as a Muslim versus Christian divide.
Not at all. It's much more nuanced than that.
Okay.
You know, religious differences can definitely make existing tensions worse.
Right.
But they often get mixed up with struggles over land resources and political power.
I can imagine how that would work.
You know, when different groups are competing for the same limited resources, things can escalate quickly.
It's almost like a pressure cooker.
Right.
With all these different factors simmering away.
Yeah.
And then something happens, a spark ignites, and the whole thing boils over.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks.
And you know what makes it even more volatile is that in many parts of Nigeria, the rule of law is weak and corruption is rampant.
I see.
That creates an environment where violence and discrimination can flourish.
Yeah.
Because there's just a lack of accountability.
So you're saying that a lack of justice is a major contributing factor?
It's huge.
Like, if perpetrators of violence know they can get away with it, they're more likely to continue their actions.
Exactly, when there are no consequences.
Right.
It creates a climate of impunity that allows the cycle of violence to continue.
Yeah.
And it also, creates a sense of hopelessness and despair for those who are targeted.
Imagine living in a place where you constantly fear for your safety.
Right.
Where you know that if something happens to you or your family, there's little chance of justice being served.
That must be incredibly demoralizing.
It is. And that sense of hopelessness can actually contribute to further violence.
It can.
When people feel they have no other recourse, they might feel like they have to take matters into their own hands to protect themselves.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. And it's hard to see how to break out of it.
Yeah.
It's like everyone is trapped in this system that perpetuates violence and suffering.
It's definitely a complex challenge, and there are no easy answers.
Right.
But one thing that needs to happen is that we need to start addressing those underlying socioeconomic disparities that contribute to the tension.
You're talking about things like poverty, lack of education, limited opportunities.
Exactly. When people feel marginalized and excluded, they're more vulnerable to extremist ideologies.
That makes sense.
They might be more likely to resort to violence as a way to express their frustration or try to improve their situation.
So, in a way, investing in development, education, job creation could be seen as a form of violence prevention.
Absolutely. By creating opportunities for all Nigerians. regardless of their religious or ethnic background,
Yeah.
you can help create a more inclusive and peaceful society.
Right.
It won't happen overnight.
No.
It's a long-term solution.
Yeah.
But it's essential if we want to see lasting change.
It sounds like a massive undertaking.
It is.
But it makes sense.
Yeah.
If you can address the root causes of the conflict,
right?
You can start to chip away at the foundation of violence.
That's the idea. It's about shifting from a reactive approach, where we're constantly responding to crises, to a more proactive approach, where we're trying to prevent those crises from happening in the first place.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the internal factors that are contributing to this violence.
Yeah.
But what about the role of the international community?
Okay.
Like, what responsibility do other countries have to intervene and protect those who are facing persecution?
That's a really important question.
It is.
And one that's been debated for a long time.
Right.
There are those who believe that other countries have a moral obligation to intervene in situations like this, to protect human rights and prevent genocide.
And on the other side, you have those who argue that it's not the place of other countries to interfere in what they see as internal affairs.
Right.
They might say that intervention could make the situation worse.
Yeah.
Or that it could be seen as a form of imperialism.
Exactly. So it's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Sounds like it.
But I think one thing that's clear is that the international community can't simply stand by and do nothing. We have to find ways to support those who are working for peace and justice in Nigeria and hold those responsible for the violence accountable.
So you're saying that a combination of internal and external pressure is needed to bring about real change?
I think so. It's about finding a balance between respecting Nigeria's sovereignty and upholding our shared responsibility to protect human rights.
But what does that look like in practice? What concrete steps can the international community take to make a difference?
Well, for starters, there needs to be more consistent and vocal condemnation of the violence.
Okay.
You know, right now it feels like these attacks happen.
Yeah.
There's a brief flurry of media attention. And then everyone moves on.
It's like people become desensitized to the violence because it's become so commonplace.
Yeah.
We hear about another attack, we feel sad for a moment, and then we go back to our lives.
Exactly. So we need to break that cycle.
Okay.
We need to keep this issue in the spotlight.
Yeah.
And make sure that the world doesn't forget about the suffering of Christians in Nigeria.
So more media attention.
Right.
More pressure on the Nigerian government to take action and more support for those who are working for peace and reconciliation on the ground.
Those are all good starting points.
Yeah.
But we also need to be thinking about more long-term solutions.
Okay. Like what?
Things like targeted sanctions against individuals who are known to be involved in the violence, supporting initiatives that promote interfaith dialogue and understanding, and investing in development programs that can help to address some of the underlying economic and social factors that contribute to the conflict.
It sounds like it's going to take a multi-pronged approach.
It is.
A combination of short-term and long-term strategies to really make a difference.
Absolutely. And it's going to require a sustained effort from the international community.
Yeah.
We can't just have a few bursts of outrage and then go back to business as usual.
Okay.
We need to be in this for the long haul.
Okay, so we've talked about what the international community can do.
Right.
But what about us as individuals?
Okay.
It can feel so overwhelming to face a problem this big.
Yeah.
What can we possibly do to make a difference?
You know, it's easy to feel powerless
Right.
in the face of such widespread suffering.
Yeah.
But I truly believe that even small actions can have an impact.
Okay, I like that.
The first step is to educate ourselves about the issue, to learn about the complexities of the conflict, and to understand the different ways in which we can help.
So knowledge is power, as they say.
That is.
But what can we do with that knowledge?
Well, once we understand the issue, we can start to raise awareness within our own communities.
Okay.
We can talk to our friends and family about what's happening in Nigeria.
Yeah.
We can share information on social media.
Right.
We can write to our elected officials and urge them to take action.
So it's about using our voices to amplify the voices of those who are suffering.
Exactly. And there are other things we can do as well. We can support organizations that are working on the ground in Nigeria.
Okay.
To provide aid to those who have been displaced by the violence. To promote peace and reconciliation, and to advocate for justice and accountability.
So donations, volunteering, spreading awareness, those are all things that individuals can do to contribute.
Exactly. And another really important thing we can do is to pray for peace in Nigeria.
Yeah.
I know that might sound cliche, but I truly believe that prayer can be a powerful force for change.
I agree. And sometimes when we feel helpless in the face of tragedy,
Right.
prayer can be a way to connect with something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah.
And to offer our support in a way that feels meaningful.
Absolutely. And even if we can't physically be there in Nigeria,
Right.
we can offer our prayers and our support from afar.
Okay, so we've talked about the need for internal and external pressure, the importance of education and awareness, and the role that individuals can play in making a difference. But I'm still left with this question. Is there any reason for hope? I mean, the situation seems so dire, so entrenched.
Yeah.
Is there any reason to believe that things can actually get better?
I think that's the question we all need to grapple with.
Yeah.
And while it's easy to get discouraged,
Yeah.
to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problem,
Yeah.
I believe there's always reason for hope.
I'd love to hear why you feel that way.
Okay.
What gives you hope in the face of such a challenging situation? Yeah, I get it. It's easy to get bogged down by the sheer scale of all this. But I'm curious, what makes you feel hopeful about the situation?
Well, for one thing, there's a growing global awareness of what's happening. Organizations like Open Doors and International Christian Concern, they're doing some incredible work to document these atrocities, raise awareness, and push for change.
Right.
Just the fact that we're even having this conversation today is a sign that their efforts are making a difference.
That's a good point. It seems like just a few years ago, this issue wasn't even on most people's radar.
Right.
Now it's being discussed in parliaments, in the media, and even at our dinner tables.
Exactly. And that increased awareness is putting pressure on governments and international bodies to take action.
Okay.
So we're seeing more resolutions, more condemnations, and more calls for accountability.
But as we've discussed, awareness alone isn't enough.
You're right. It's not.
What we really need to see is concrete action.
Yeah.
Tangible steps towards justice and a lasting peace.
Absolutely. And that's where things get more challenging.
Right.
But there are initiatives underway that offer some hope.
Okay. I'd like to hear about that.
For example, some organizations are working directly with communities in Nigeria to promote dialogue between different faiths.
Interesting.
They're focusing on peace building and reconciliation at the grassroots level.
So it's about building bridges between communities.
Yeah.
Fostering understanding and empathy.
Yeah.
It sounds like that's a crucial part of any long-term solution.
It's absolutely essential. We need to move beyond simply condemning the violence and start addressing the deeper divisions that fuel it.
Wow.
You need to create spaces where people from different faiths can come together, share their stories, and start to build relationships based on mutual respect.
It's like that old saying, you can't hate someone whose story, you know?
Exactly. And that's why these interfaith initiatives are so important.
Right.
They're creating opportunities for people to connect on a human level.
Yeah.
To see each other not as enemies, but as fellow human beings who share a common humanity.
It sounds like a long and difficult process.
It is.
But it feels like a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
It is. But what about the role of the Nigerian government?
Okay.
What steps can they take to protect all their citizens and ensure justice for those who have been targeted?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
The Nigerian government has a fundamental responsibility to uphold the rights of all its citizens. Regardless of their religious beliefs,
Right.
they need to take concrete steps
Yeah.
to address this culture of impunity,
Okay.
strengthen the rule of law, and hold perpetrators of violence accountable.
So that means reforming the justice system,
Yeah.
tackling corruption, and investing in security forces that are trained to protect all citizens.
Yes.
Not just those of a particular faith.
You got it. It also means investing in education and creating economic opportunities for all Nigerians,
Yeah.
regardless of their background.
Right.
Poverty and inequality are breeding grounds for extremism and violence.
So it's a holistic approach.
Yes.
You have to address the immediate security concerns.
Right.
While also working to build a more just and equitable society in the long term.
Exactly. It's a complex challenge, but not an insurmountable one.
Right.
And while the international community can play a supporting role, ultimately the solution lies within Nigeria itself.
That's an important point. While international pressure and support are important, it's ultimately up to the Nigerian people and their leaders to chart a path towards peace and reconciliation.
I couldn't agree more. And that's where I find another reason for hope.
Oh, really?
Despite the immense challenges they face,
Yeah.
there are countless Nigerians from all walks of life and all faiths who are working tirelessly to build a better future for their country.
And those are the stories we need to amplify.
Yes.
The voices of hope and resilience that are often drowned out by the headlines of violence and despair.
Well said. And I think that's a good note to end on.
Yeah.
While the situation in Nigeria is undeniably grim, it's not a story of despair. It's a story of ongoing struggle, resilience, and the unwavering belief in a better tomorrow.
That's a powerful message.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a thought. What can we each do in our own way to contribute to a more peaceful and just world?
Right.
Whether it's staying informed, raising awareness, supporting organizations on the ground.
Or simply having these difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Every action, no matter how small, can make a difference.
It really can.
Thanks for joining us on this challenging but crucial deep dive.
Thank you.
And to all those in Nigeria and around the world who are facing persecution, we stand with you in the fight for a world where everyone can live freely and practice their faith without fear.